There's no such thing as an original idea. There's only ideas that are adapted, extended, or improved to meet one's particular need or circumstances. I like Mark Twain's version better, but this one was more concise. So I'm going to give you guys a little anecdote. I had this issue when I was out and about where my wife got these cravings for Diet Cherry Coke. And the store had Diet Coke or they had Cherry Coke, but not Diet Cherry. The convenience store closest to us did have Diet Cherry, but it was in a small 20-ounce size. And you would pay 3 times the cost, basically. So one day I got proactive about it, and while shopping in the store, a light bulb went off. I knew the store had Diet Coke, and I thought for sure they must have cherry extract, which I did find. This cherry extract, if kept in the refrigerator, would put an end to all the scrambling trying to find Diet Cherry. Yes, this was to be a synthesis, and there's 3 important facts to note here. The original labels are carefully shown. The new product or synthesis is not made to dominate or replace the original, especially by leveraging special benefits and or underhanded techniques. And if you think that's crazy, just think about corporate espionage, industrial sabotage, insider trading. And also, I'm not repackaging this synthesis for profit, at least not without some mutual agreement. I came up with these 3 facts after watching a TED Talk by a man named Kawasaki titled The 3 Ps of Cultural Appropriation. They include property, privilege, and profit. Now, switching gears. In the arts I study, one thing seems so inherently true to me that I made a motto. They say, pick a system and stick with it. I say, pick a stick from it and make a system. Looking back at it now, it's the hows and whys that need to be examined when deeming something an honorable synthesis. I discovered Led Zeppelin when I was 7 years old. I fell in love. I played physical graffiti from front to back and stopped only to fix the tape when it came unwound. Their whole catalog stuck on me. As a teenager, I began producing my own music. It gained so much steam that a partner and I started our own record label, Top Rise Records, LLC. So we spent 3 years on a 19-track album, and on one of the beats, I sampled Zeppelin's No Quarter. Eventually, we raised enough money for mastering in a 5,000-unit replication package. One of my first stops was the local mom-and-pop record shop, where the owner listened for 5 minutes and handed the album back saying he couldn't carry something with uncleared samples. He said, Atlantic Records reps come in here every now and then. I don't want it to compromise my business. That was but one disappointment, and it was other personal blows that led to my abandonment of 3 years of work. As an adult, I became interested in the hows and whys of the world. One day, I applied this curiosity to Led Zeppelin. How did they create that sound? Why did they sound so unique? As one documentary, Led Zeppelin Dazed and Confused, puts it, combining the raw power and intensity of hard rock with the finesse of contemporary blues and the delicacy of British folk music, Led Zeppelin's revolutionary sound redefined rock in the 1970s. To me, the band's bold use of experimentation and eclectic themes was harmonized into one grand synthesis. It's creativity. It stands out. It's unique. While I think they objectively proved to be a synthesis, namely that their material draws from many sources and is well beyond a mere copy, there arose other factors to consider regarding the way in which it was done. Let's specifically zoom in on one source, the blues aspect of Led Zeppelin. Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, like many artists, were sometimes neglectful in paying homage, much less royalties, to the artists they sampled from. It has been well documented, and that's where I came across pioneers like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Skip James, Elmore James, and Leadbelly, artists who were successful but relatively exploited. Even if Led Zeppelin's business end was fully intact, to some, shout-outs and back pay would always be half measures. To understand why, one needs to understand the context of the situation. Early blues was born out of the segregated and politically turbulent South, the American Deep South. Blues was created by marginalized Black Americans, descendants of enslaved peoples, who despite their struggle created an outlet to express their individuality. In the book Invisible Man, written by Ralph Ellison, the author crystallizes the historic context in one sentence. As a form, the blues is an autobiographical chronicle of personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. Elaborating on that, one journalist, Tom Taylor from Far Out magazine, writes, "The Mississippi River was how the enslaved were shipped south to the plantations of the Delta. This was the despairing seeding ground where modern music crawled out of the mirror and misery of one of humanity's great atrocities and etched itself as gilded poetry written in the margins of one of the darkest pages in history." Modern music, y'all. And this is just one of many other broader patterns. We're talking about past events with effects to this very day. And this is where cultural appropriation enters the chat. This is where the case regarding my reassessment of Led Zeppelin opens up. And I'm conflicted. My appreciation for their synthesis is still personally real, but my passionate beliefs of pursuing equality, connecting through commonalities, and using diversity as a strength took a personal hit by some of the ways in which this synthesis was done. Truth be told, this isn't about Roundabout Diet Cherry or Led Zeppelin and the blues. There was a former challenge that led me to these avenues. That was when somebody asked me, "How can you support the Western Esoteric Tradition when it is based on bastardizations of other culture systems?" Knowing that the systems were meant to be progressive, and knowing that there was so much nuance regarding sourcing and makeup of what the Western Esoteric Tradition actually is, I automatically became defensive and dismissed the term bastardization. I put on my best version of relaying certain contraries, but we ran out of time and nuance escaped me. However, I embraced the question containing a statement, started reorganizing knowns, opened my mind to unknowns, and welcomed a new perspective on how and why the Western Esoteric Tradition is a conglomerate. Full disclosure, because I was already studying postmodernism, including the newer radical type, I decided to rephrase the question with some wording that had been popping up lately. On the Foolish Fish Discord, I dropped the term bastardization and asked in a way that I thought was less assuming. Many of the systems I study are a conglomerate. Where do you draw the line between cultural appropriation and inclusivity? One user stated that the cross-cultural trading of ideas is normal, and that it's the power imbalances in society along various lines that's bad. Not, as they put it, that you're from Wisconsin and do yoga. Another user noted the similarities of deities and pantheons through the ages. They stated that even the most unadulterated belief structure that has been totally isolated from outside influence is going to be different than it was at its genesis. Damn. It has always struck me that the esoterically inclined found some real gold along the way. To my surprise, the Foolish Fish owner himself chimed in and explained that he would soon be doing a video involving some of these issues. By the time you hear this, it'll already be out. Link in the description. To be clear, I'm casually flipping between bastardization and cultural appropriation here. But I don't think the words are identical. The person who asked the original question used bastardization in the context of a previously discussed Eurocentrism. I mean, Western is literally in the name, Western Esoteric Tradition. It's an umbrella term that includes worldwide influences, so I think the question is valid at its core. After consulting the online group, I specifically focused on the original baked-in statement, bastardization. Here's a definition of bastardization. So I had to consider if taking elements from an original source and dropping the name would most accurately be described as a bastardization, something I may have been accused of myself with restructuring the original question, had one not known our previous discussions. I thought, if that were the case, would identity politics be a bastardization of Marxism? In music, would any chop sample fall into that lowly category? I pondered these questions literally. I found that some would favor adaptation, because the product was never meant to be a knockoff. Also, if you lend credence to the idea that we live in a postmodern world where culture simulates culture at a hyperbolic rate, how do we even distinguish what is original? How do we put the brakes on the train and not all be hypocrites? without needing to be genius savants at least, or attaining a constant state of transpersonal consciousness at best. With a willingness to be open-minded, the initial question was forcing me to consider two sides at once, like, what about somebody who knows oppression is real, but will never be able to make a universal solution if held to a concept otherwise only selectively used? Relativism. Here's a definition for relativism. This is where I became overwhelmed, and it might have explained some of my frustrations with society seemingly enforcing aspects of one theory only when it suits them. Ironically, the basis for the older problems in the first place. But hell, I take individual sticks for my abstractions too. We all do it. It's synthesis. I may even cherry pick from time to time, which you will soon see in my book quotes. But another perspective may argue that I was simply using the right tool or stick for the job. What is absolute anymore? I mean, really. One argument against the original philosophical postmodernists is that they find themselves swimming in circles. I started to feel like that's what I was doing. Listless, in worlds between worlds, daunted more than ever by having to explain Western esotericism under a modern social ethics lens. The hard truth was, I wasn't an authority on any of this. I was just a dude, searching for my own gold. The best I could do was try and pick out a few things that seemed to stand out to me on this new ambiguous front. Perspectivism is the idea that perception and knowledge are always bound to the perspectives of those observing it. Truth and value are interpretive. No one has an absolute view of the world cut off from perspective. Somebody up in the mountains could say, "It's foggy today," while somebody down in the valley could say, "It's overcast." Subjective truth is a truth based off perspectives, feelings, and opinions. We rely on our senses to collect data and our brain to process it. We string up all the products and come out with ideas or schemas. And if we want to express it, we must rely on language, which is just a symbol of the original idea substance. We can both agree that the apple is red, but we can't prove that we're seeing the exact same color. This is a simple example, but the more you dive into nuance, the more ambiguous reality gets. Cognitive dissonance is when two truths that are opposite exist in a person's psyche at the same time, resulting in discomfort. Some psychologists theorize that a person will try to resolve this conflict in a way where one thought comes out on top and the less valuable thought is discarded. But other people think that a sign of wisdom is having the capacity to sometimes hold two opposing thoughts at once, essentially thriving in a gray area. The Hegelian dialectic was Georg Friedrich Hegel's model on how things evolve. It is comprised of three stages of development: a thesis, giving rise to its reaction, the antithesis, which contradicts or negates the thesis, and the tension between the two being resolved by means of a synthesis. It is important to note that the synthesis is not a total abandonment of the original elements, but a harmonizing of. I think it would be safe to say that at any given point, a traditionalist would look to preserve an element, while a progressive would look to, well, further adapt. And just as a bonus, I want to touch on something about the Western Esoteric Tradition. That phrase is a misnomer. It's not an actual tradition, but an umbrella term, a very general scholarly construct. I think that West is in the name because it's from a Western point of view, not that certain Westerners are taking ownership on the elements of the esoteric teachings. Just to show us how language and generalizations fail us, practices vary from group to group. Theosophy is not modern paganism. Thelema is not Freemasonry. So maybe I bear part of the blame with perpetuating the misnomer with inexactness for those who don't know. As much as I'd rather be exploring psychedelic melodies and deep diving into metaphysics, I guess the tides have been coming in for a while, having to intersect it all with society's hot-button topics. So I was pressing on, conflicted with Led Zeppelin, unable to pin down any universal answers with social philosophy, and challenged to explain how my claims of inclusivity fit in with, at least by namesake, Eurocentric Western esotericism. One thing that did make sense was that these new themes seemed as unassuming and inclusive as the very books I've come to appreciate. Those that seemed to go against a flawed orthodoxy without sacrificing bearing. But the destination still seemed so open-ended. I wasn't fully nihilistic, but still wondered if shipwreck or honorable synthesis lay on the horizon. Saying Occultism by Dion Fortune. It is an admitted fact that all temples of the mysteries were symbolic structures. If we want to understand their symbolism, we must enter into the mind of their makers, men like ourselves, concerned with esoteric science. So this book is almost 100 years old. I picked some of the more modern classics because I wanted to get my footing. This quote, and there's many to be pulled, is important because it shows a motive. Also, it shows a reverence for the cultures being studied, ones that are so old that they're defunct and gone. Let's look at another one from that author. Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune. Kabbalah is a growing system, not a historic monument. Everything must have a source. Cultures do not spring out of nothing. The seed bearers of each new phase of culture must of necessity arise from the preceding culture. I would not willingly mislead anyone concerning the teachings of those ancient days. This whole page, really, multiple pages, I'm having the cherry pick. And it's important because it talks about the very nature of progression. And as a bonus, ethics is kind of addressed. Rosicrucian Enlightenment by Francis Yates, with a section on Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. What surprised the guests of the island most was that the inhabitants of New Atlantis knew all the languages of Europe, and seemed also to know of all the affairs of the outside world, and the state of knowledge in it, yet they themselves were quite unknown and unheard of outside their own country. Every 12 years, 3 of the followers or brethren of Solomon's house should go forth on a mission to collect knowledge of the state of arts and sciences, to bring back books, instruments, and news. This trade, it was explained, was not a commerce in ordinary material commodities, but only a seeking for God's first creature, which was light, I say, of the growth of all the parts of the world. So, this is coming from a scholar who specialized in history of the Renaissance, and the section on Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis interested me so much that I bought New Atlantis, and that's kind of how you follow follow the breadcrumbs. And New Atlantis, it's a mythological utopia novel, and it's so important, or I liked it so much, because it contains a practical philosophy. The idea is to advance society by combining all the world's knowledge and then turning it back on freedom-inducing civil efforts. It has been argued that this work influenced liberal constitutions like the American Constitution and later reforms like women's rights and the abolition of slavery. It was written by a man who was once the Lord Chancellor of England, a heavyweight in science, philosophy, and religion. So these ideas aren't just coming from known namers in obscure corners. And I know that's not necessarily saying anything, but it's a part of a historic chain, larger events known as the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. Having no particular ism of my own to promulgate, I have not attempted to twist the original writings to substantiate preconceived notions, nor have I distorted doctrines in any effort to reconcile the irreconcilable differences present in various systems of religio-philosophic thought. I have studied the fragmentary writings of the ancients sufficiently to realize that dogmatic utterances concerning their tenets are worse than foolhardy. Traditionalism is the curse of modern philosophy, particularly that of the European schools. By all rights, this is the first modern-era encyclopedia of the arcane, from Freemasonry all the way back to Greek philosophy. I think the quote is important because the author takes time to note that he's not looking to confirm any bias. It's merely a survey. And for some of the antiquated things that luckily we're moving away from, that came from that era when it was published, I think when you take secret knowledge or any type of knowledge and publish it for the general public, it's a beacon of hope. It's an example of moving in the right direction. Theurgy in the Soul by Brian Shaw. Yet why would Iamblichus adopt a pseudonym of an Egyptian priest in order to explain his Platonic mystagogy? According to the later Platonists, the answer was clear. Plato himself had acknowledged that his writings were merely a propheteia to deeper mysteries, and in several dialogues he spoke of the influence of Oriental, particularly Egyptian wisdom on his thought. The Oriental element in Iamblichus's Platonism should not be seen as alien, but an attempt to reveal more completely the wellspring of Platonic wisdom. Okay, this is another academic-style book, full of citations, footnotes, a nice index, which isn't necessarily a make-or-break thing for me, but if you like following the leads or need that authority, and especially considering the power of this whole open-source research concept, as I call them, following the breadcrumbs. And it's a modern scholar looking at a 4th century Neoplatonist, Iamblichus, who in turn was looking at even older traditions. So you can see a pattern here. It is theorized that Neoplatonism, including Iamblichus's theurgy, had an influence on the magical traditions from the Middle Ages on up, and even Orthodox Christianity, with all of its threads and evolutions. One example is baptism. It's a ritual, literally a ritual. Basically, I'm just painting a picture here. There's a broad intermingling of growth and ideas. It's always been that way. The Esoteric Path by Luc Benoist. There are as many of these sacred sites as there are traditions. They are all linked to a holy land, seat of the primordial tradition, the supreme land according to the Sanskrit word Paradesha, from which the Chaldeans derived their word Pardes, in the Western world paradise. For if indirect and discursive knowledge depends on the reasoning mind, direct intuitive understanding depending on the attainment of higher states depends on the knowing heart. This knowing heart is not an individual possession, but is a universal property, as is what is known by it. This is a lesser-known gem. It was written in the early 60s, and I think it's a good primer for esotericism in general, especially from a Hermetic viewpoint. It's basically a succinct cross-examination of all the world's major esoteric traditions. And if you know anything about comparative religion, you find commonalities. I think mutual understanding is something we can all use. And to me, after reading a lot of different authors and a lot of different traditions, it seems like the esotericists have always done this well. Secret History of the World by Mark Booth. Copernicus acknowledged that his ideas came from reading texts from the ancient world, and when Kepler formulated his theories, he was conscious of the ancient wisdom working through him. Kepler was a lifelong friend of Richard Bachelard, who worked closely with John Valentin Andrea, and is often thought to have been his collaborator on the Rosicrucian Manifestos. Isaac Newton, then in his school days, lodged with an apothecary who turned out to be an alchemical adept, and Newton's path lay clear before him. Newton, no less than Cornelius Agrippa, tried to discover the complete system of the world. This is kind of like a coffee table book, like a Barnes & Noble's, with the sticker, $10, but it's really good. And I picked this quote out the book because it shows real-life implications to these things. It's not just fantasy. Literally, it's embedded in who we are. Specifically, we're talking about the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, which can be argued signified a shift more towards human rights. 3 Books of Occult Philosophy by Cornelius Agrippa. These are the gods to which all people are assigned, which Moses anticipated, saying in Deuteronomy, "Lest perhaps your eyes are lifted to heaven, seeing the sun and moon, and all of the stars of the sky, and being turned against God, you adore and serve them, to which all people are assigned, which are under the whole heaven. But Lord Tetragrammaton has carried and led you from the furnace of Egypt, so that he would make you his inherited people." Agrippa goes on with, And in the same book, in the 7th chapter, he called the sun, moon, and the stars gods. So 3 books is like the granddaddy of occult encyclopedias, but it wasn't for the general masses. It was within the academy. Being among the learned and in these circles in the 16th century, Agrippa had to choose his words wisely because the academy was tied in with the church. One of the hallmarks of somebody interested in the spiritual in this capacity is also being interested in the world, as above, so below. Agrippa covers classical, medieval, Renaissance periods and draws from the Hebrews, Persians, and Indians to synthesize his occult philosophy. Likewise, in this line of work, as Regardi says, you're encouraged to expand your horizons, including the mundane, history, psychology, the sciences, the arts. To me, it's all relative. Spirituality is only understood in context of the mundane. The Early Years of the Golden Dawn by Israel Regardie. The Rosicrucian revival of mysticism was but a new development of the vastly older wisdom of the Kabbalistic rabbis, and of that very ancient secret knowledge, the magic of the Egyptians, in which the Hebrew Pentateuch tells you that Moses, the founder of the Jewish system, was learned, that is, in which he had been initiated. Now we're taking it back to the Golden Dawn. Israel Regardie was another occultist out the 20th century who, despite internal blowback, published the secret knowledge for the general public. And that example that we just went over, whether you want to lend it credence or not, is a good example of how knowledge is passed down regardless of religion and ethnicity. The idea of finding commonality, establishing links, and pressing forward. These are the very things which jumped off these pages and, resonated with me over the years, things I believed in. And for one last random quote, we'll pull from Christianity. Gospel of Matthew 13:10. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. But I digress. Even making my own remix of what this Western esotericism means to me doesn't do the originals justice. If you thought I'd tie this up into one big smoking gun, I guess I'll just refer back to the idea that perspective is highly individualized, broader accuracy is found in nuance, and I personally don't know any savants. Like, even in my experience, transpersonal states were fleeting at best. But I'll tell you this, I feel like I could find links all day, while some are fixated on doing the opposite. Some Christians may hate that I put magic in it. Some magicians may hate that I put Christianity in it. They will each come with valid examples of the most wretched wrongdoing. And don't get me wrong, these things absolutely should be addressed. But we can't miss the examples of learning, compassion, love, and joint efforts towards a more collective progress. We must not retract into our enclaves of fear, turning our interlinked nodes into private echo chambers. Let us find commonalities first, and use our diversity as a strength. Let us, in fact, outmatch these wrongs. Let us build libraries like Alexandria, trade notes like the Sufis and Templars, discover new sciences by drawing inspiration from the greats, in a way that pays both dividends and honor. I think somehow on this new ambiguous front, we could harmonize these perspectives into one grand synthesis, whether it be roundabout diet cherry or the philosopher's stone. And to those who understand through direct experience, it's already known. The fear-built echo chambers can't undo that which is inextricably linked. In that spirit, your work is my work. I'll stop what I'm doing and come help if you want. For as the famous axiom says, as within, so without. This is just my genuine, subjective truth, led by unverifiable personal gnosis, hampered by a whole bunch of mistakes, and ever-changing in between the worlds. Results is what it did me, but I'm sorry for all the times I fell short. I'm no expert, but I am interested in uniting the opposites. As a matter of fact, if you happen to have noticed, I've been saying it all along. We're doing this one mission at a time. A chemical weapon's at hand over here. Over and out.